Here we are with John Havens. Welcome to Climate of Change, John.
My pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
I would like to kick off this podcast by introducing you, and then the next step will be talking about metrics in general because you're passionate about that. And then at the end, we might get in deeper into what your institute is actually doing out there. John, could you please tell our viewers and our listeners who is John Havens?
Sure. And thank you again. So I work with an organization called IEEE. And as you mentioned, that first I is Institute, and all the other E's focus on engineers. It's been around for about 100 years. It was created by Thomas Edison. And IEEE has, I think it's about 500,000 members in more than 160 countries. So it's very big. One of the operating units of IEEE is the Standards Association, and that's where I work. I'm on staff, and my title is Director of Emerging Technology and Strategic Development. And since about 2016, I've led what, as far as I know, is IEEE's largest artificial intelligence and ethics work. I have written 3 books. The most recent one is called Heartificial Intelligence, Embracing Our Humanity to Maximize Machines, which we might talk about today. And I've also written for places like The Guardian and Mashable and TechCrunch, mainly focusing on the intersection of technology and well-being, which includes human physiology and mental health and economics.
We'll make sure that we refer to the books in the video description. Welcome.
Yeah, we'll certainly do. That's an impressive CV, John.
Thank you.
Thank you. You mentioned the title of your new book, Heartificial Intelligence. We have met before a little bit, and it's to me it was striking to see that you are really passionate about what you're doing. So you're coming from the heart space. Can I ask you a personal question? Why is that important to you?
Well, I forgot to mention in terms of my CV, in college, I thought I was going to be a minister in a Christian tradition. I wasn't sure what denomination, but my mom is a minister, so I thought I might be a pastor. And while I was in school, I had a double major of history and theater. And my theater professor, this wonderful guy named Earl Genzel, knew that I loved acting because I'm a big ham, apparently. And he said, don't go into the pulpit thinking that you want to be an actor. And it's interesting how many actors I've known who have been either ministers or priests or rabbis or what have you, and vice versa. So I actually, for about 15 years, was a professional actor in New York, did Broadway TV and film. And my dad was a psychiatrist. So I bring all that up to say that I sort of was born into kind of an emotional place. I just naturally kind of wear my heart on my sleeve. And then my dad actually worked, I guess, literally in human emotion. And my mom works in emotion and faith. So the things that a lot of times people don't spend time on, at least in the United States where I'm based, it's not that they don't spend time on it. They don't necessarily analyze it unless they say have a therapist. That's naturally where I go first. If I find that my work, if my heart isn't in it, to use that phrase, meaning if I don't passionately feel like it can move me, it feels harder to believe that it would move someone else.
You're resonating with me, and I'm sure you're resonating with Jan also.
Absolutely. Yeah. I was actually always chosen for the school plays as the main actor, even though I did never recommend myself or show that I was interested. But yeah, there's some connection there, sure.
Absolutely, and what I found very challenging in this world is when you're actually coming from, let's say, the hard space. Um, it's quite challenging to find your economic viability in this system. It's a challenge. I have worked with. I'm quite creative myself, not in terms that I make art or anything. I'm just a creative person, and Janne is my buddy is a designer, and it's a challenge to monetize, your creativity that actually comes from your heart space in this economic system. And I think we have a touching point here because I don't feel that anybody is talking about it, let alone uh, we're not measuring it in any way. And that brings me to the topic of metrics in our society. Um, I think we are measuring the wrong things. What do you think, John?
Um, in essence, yes, I agree. I think we're only measuring certain things, and that has done us wrong. And by that, I mean gross domestic product, or GDP, where it really got its origins at a physical location called Bretton Woods, which is in New Hampshire. I think, yeah, it's New Hampshire. I tend to confuse New Hampshire and Vermont, but I think it's New Hampshire. And it was right after the Second World War. And the values of that era, or the zeitgeist, or the need of that era after the Second World War, which makes sense in one sense, is the rapid and exponential growth of all the different countries involved in the Second World War, meaning
Yeah.
there was so much that was laying ruins. It wasn't a question of, well, let's take 10 or 20 years to repair infrastructure. It was, people are dying. We have to get the countries back on track. So I
Yeah,
bring that
build
up to say,
houses, reconstruction, railroads, roads, everything.
yeah, exactly. And so when you have that in context, then that meeting makes a lot more sense, except that what also happened at that meeting is the US dollar was cemented as a global sort of standard of currency. And if I get any of this wrong, I'm mainly talking about the metrics question. But in essence, I know these things. Like the IMF was created. I think the World Bank was created. But that era in the 1940s or late 1940s also meant that at that meeting, it was all men. There were, as far as I know, again, there may have been a few women, but prominence was mainly given to men, and from the countries that, in that case, had won the war. So all that means is that the standards then of what was determined as success for a society, which kind of turned into the statistical measures of GDP, were incredibly myopic and very, very focused on a small number of financial metrics, also backwards facing quarterly metrics that in the corporate world, I know I was, when I was in the corporate world, very used to knowing, like, how are my numbers doing this quarter? But it's not really how humans function. You wake up every day and you're wondering, how am I doing today? And that's really, you're thinking about your moods, your emotions, and your interactions with other people. And there are ways to measure that. And I can tell you more about that in a minute.
I understand what you're saying here because we are in Europe, as you know, we're from the Netherlands and in France at the very moment, and yeah, everything was destroyed after the Second World War. So we found a way, I think, and it was a good way to basically rebuild our societies in any way we could, and have a measurement system about that reconstruction, which today we call gross domestic product. So it makes sense when you have to uh, rebuild or build something new, uh, because then by definition you have economic growth. So it makes sense to me that we actually did that.
I'm only interrupting in the sense of, it makes sense they did it then in one sense. It's unfortunate, and that's a massive understatement, that along with the monetary system driving economics at that time, because it wasn't like it was unknown, especially with things like the atom bombs, how this affected the physical environment. And in terms of just simple infrastructure issues, how what was being counted or not would affect every country around the world. So even though at that point, understandably it was early in the sort of sustainability kind of conversations, or people didn't really even have that term, it wasn't like there weren't many people on the planet, especially many, indigenous cultures, etc., that already had a central ideology of caretaking for the planet, not just living on the planet and taking resources that they needed, but understanding that it's a very much reciprocal, let's call it relationship, versus an extractive one. And it was poor design. Period. I'm happy to say that. And by the way, I'm speaking here as John. I don't formally represent IEEE because it's got a board and all that. But the point being, it was bad design in the sense of moving forward, all these infrastructure issues, et cetera, measuring things like how did the climate get affected last year, besides the fact that farmers with almanacs have known this, for millennia, right? Planning ahead and designing around human well-being and economics, but recognizing the planet means you also have resources like water, whatever you need to actually take care of your citizens and your crops. But if you're not planning ahead and thinking, how can we again heal or restore or improve the physical ecosystems around us, then what you are also saying is we are choosing short-termism, which is a design choice economically in every other way. And it's also saying, essentially, because short-termism usually is either quarterly or maybe 5, maybe 10 years. You're saying, and I'm being this provocative on purpose because I know we had a great call to prepare for this. You're also saying, in one sense, we don't really care about children. Now, I'm going to say that, and people might look at this and go like, of course we care about our children. And my answer is, I don't think so. I think if the first discussions are about economics first, and then you think, well, then how with this budget can we take care of children? It must be reversed. That discussion has to be reversed. How do we have metrics to recognize that anything we build, whether it's AI or whatever technology, will affect our children and can be used to help them? But if that's not the first priority that you have metrics for, that those are the key performance indicators in business speak or KPI, then what you're saying is we're not prioritizing children or caregiving and the planet or human well-being and environmental sustainability. We're prioritizing the idea, the ideology that by putting economics first, society will improve. Whereas in fact, that has been shown for the majority of the planet for the past 70 years to damage and harm all of the planet's inhabitants. So bad design is something I like to talk about because it kind of removes aspects of morals and people don't understand measuring emotion. And okay, but for systems engineers or people who think in a systems mindset, you don't create a piece of technology and just put it into some sort of ether where there's no people or planet, around it. You introduce it into an existing ecosystem of people and planetary factors.
Yeah, a wonderful statement, John. I couldn't agree more. It reminds me of a phrase I actually loved, and it's quite simple. If we take care of the planet, the planet will take care of us. It's that simple. And I agree that in the economic system or in the financial system or in the monetary system or in the banking system or even in the political system, we were totally blind to any effects that our current way of thinking, because it's just a way of thinking, nothing else. It's not reality. It's just what is inside our heads, which is something else than the reality out there. So you end up measuring a dying patient on a hospital bed, and the only thing you're measuring is his blood pressure. And when his blood pressure is fine, everything is fine, which makes no sense at all.
But actually, it's even further than that. You're not just measuring the patient. You don't measure it for the patient, but you measure it for the statistics of the hospital. Like we're measuring for the result, like the product for the economy. And that's not serving humans and the planet directly. It's only a metric to see where we're heading, where we are, how much more result we have compared to the previous quarter, etc., etc.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely, Janne. And I know, John, that you dropped a phrase before in your life during some conferences you did, and I checked them online. And you made the statement that women are invisible. Could you explain that, please?
Sure. And by the way, thanks for watching the videos. You guys both a coffee or a beer, whatever, at some point. Yeah, this is not my idea. There's a wonderful woman, political. I forget what title she had. I think in New Zealand or Australia, but named Marilyn Waring, Waring, and the title of her famous book is called "If Women Counted," and that's a literal idea, going back to the Bretton Woods logic. Money is an invented construct. Now that you say that type of thing, and it starts to sound esoteric. And we had, in the U.S., we had specie in the Civil War, et cetera, issued as like Confederate notes and Northern notes. But the point being that when the dollar was solidified, that's when it became communicated to the world that symbol of one, with the U.S. dollar sign meant something. That's all it meant. It's a piece of paper that's simply a tool for communication. Now, obviously, it refers back to some kind of, again, specie that equals $1, but the $1 shifts all the time. And women, because they weren't at that conference, for instance, or because they didn't have the right to vote at that point, or whatever. And again, I give full credit to this concept, even to Marilyn Waring. But then so many other women economists who I greatly respect, Eleanor Ostrom, for instance, another woman I'm honored to consider a friend, Rihanna Eisler. She writes about this a lot in her books. What you account for is then what becomes important. And where women didn't have the vote, for instance, then politicians wouldn't care about getting women to vote for them. Now, that might sound silly and pretty basic, but then the answer is, you're right.
It's
silly
not
and
that
basic.
long. It's not that long ago.
It's not that long ago. And
No.
if men weren't used to caring about what women thought, or they just pretended to care, or maybe they cared, but they didn't change the system that didn't actually give them a vote, the same logic applies here. If the measurement, GDP, doesn't include specific metrics that measure women in caregiving, and I say caregiving meaning things like education for kids, mental and emotional health for people, then it won't be measured. It's pretty simple. Like, I say this, and sometimes people get offended and like, well, of course our country cares about children and mental health. And of course, there's so many wonderful organizations that prioritize those things. The whole point, though, is that if the one metric that the world agrees on, that we all start with, isn't focused first on caregiving, then you ask, what is it focused on? And if it's focused on exponential growth and fiscal metrics, and that's what everyone says is what makes a country good, then
Sorry,
that's how the discussion start. Yeah.
sorry to interrupt you, because I think you have a real serious point here. Because I have the impression that the appreciation or the way we build up our societies in terms of caring services, which can be anything. It can be healthcare, care for your family, care for your friends, care for the environment. There are a lot of ways to do that. It's actually depending on the current state of the GDP. Because somehow we decide that when the economy is going down, but we don't have any money left to actually finance that, which is mind-blowing. And when the economy is going up, which is actually mostly a representation of the extraction of planet Earth, we generate more money. So now we have more funding available to do something for the environment. Well, you actually just created the whole madness out there. Mind blows.
Yeah, no, I've been saying this for years based on other people's work, who I will give credit to when I remember who it is, but it's pretty well known that like if an oil tanker crashes off of the coast of a certain country, the GDP the next year will increase because jobs are formed to get the oil out.
Yeah.
And essentially that one number, because it's so myopic, it's ludicrously myopic. And I don't mind mocking this even because it means that in that example, the number that everyone says, hey, how is our country doing? When the ecosystems, certainly of the fish, and ironically, you might get that one year more jobs to people to clean up the oil spill. But what if it's a country that depends on, say, fishing or the oceanic side of things for their GDP? Then the number is, in one sense, almost obfuscation, right? There should be, or at least when reports come out, say something like, well, this next year, we'll have a good GDP next year, but keep in mind that those jobs are absolutely temporary. And not only they're only around till we clean up the oil spill, we're going to be losing a lot of our citizens because they have to move. There won't be jobs. And the ecosystem, not just to clean it up, but to restore it, may take 10 or 20 or 30 or 40 or 50 years. Yeah. So it's, again, I like pointing out all the time that it's bad design, because it's also bad design to continue to accept that this metric from 70 or 80 years ago in and of itself is anything remotely adequate. And one thing I'll mention here too, and I'll move from, somewhat depressing statistics to positive, hopefully, meaning I want to do that. I tend to do that when I talk on interviews or keynotes, is to start with the sort of, here's where we are, but here's where we can go. But by 2030, the World Health Organization said that loneliness is going to be at a pandemic state. Yeah. And I bring that up because many developed countries, and I'm using air quotes because I hate that term, because it means the countries that essentially have the economic basis to be developed, called themselves developed, and then the non-developed countries, it's all framed in financial issues. Yeah. But many of the developed countries have the highest levels of depression and suicide. That includes the US and Japan for men my age, men over 45, the second leading cause of death after coronary heart disease, which you can control to a certain degree, but it's also genetic, et cetera, is suicide. And so if a country's metrics of success are exponential growth, but the sort of tacit understanding is it's of course unfortunate about suicide and unfortunate about the state of mental health, but the GDP is going up. So you know what? Society is still doing great. If that as humans is what we think morally or anything else is appropriate to move forward with, again, I'm speaking as John, then we're doing a great job. Because by 2030, it's going to be at such high levels. People on the planet will be more so than they are now, even diminishing. I don't think that makes sense. And also from a sustainability design standpoint, it's ludicrous to say, let's keep destroying the planet and harming people versus asking first how we can increase well-being and environmental flourishing, and then figure out how the money stuff happens from there. Because if those first two things aren't taken care of, what do we got? 10, 20, 30, 50 years. So is that, I have kids, people listening to your show have kids or grandkids or people they care about. It's really important to also say, how am I helping or harming the next generation? And a lot of indigenous cultures have, I think it's either the 6 or 7 or 16, this logic of everything you do, think about the next 6 or more generations and how your action.
I know that one from the native Indians in America, the 7th generation philosophy.
Yeah,
but any important decision you take has an effect on the coming generations, which we don't see a lot in daily politics or business.
Well, I'm so glad, because I did want to get to positive stuff. I think, first of all, a couple of things. I love coming to Europe for any number of reasons from the US. But many countries when I visit, and I know that my friends in those areas, of course, still have complaints and concerns, which makes sense. But where, say, there's universal health care in a country, and I won't name a particular country, and of course, that's never going to be automatically easy, right? Or at least I'll name some countries, Canada, the UK, there's issues. But in the US, I was an actor, as I mentioned, for a number of years. And some years I had health insurance and some years I didn't. And Gallup which is the world's largest holder of data about human well-being, they've had a lot of reports about how often one thinks about health insurance when you don't have it and how much it actually has a literal physiological effect, a negative one, on your well-being. So you walk around, in a state of not mild panic, some of the costs for healthcare, just going to the emergency room, thousands and thousands of dollars. So I bring that up because a lot of times when I go to Europe, it doesn't mean that everything's automatically simple or easy, but where people have access to health insurance, or a lot of friends in Helsinki, and Finland is often said to have the best education system in the world, where you see kids raised where they sort of have a sense of worth and they are prioritized. And I'm speaking for Finland in a very broad sense, but I'm saying this in a very positive, complimentary way, which is it's not about what are their math scores and are they going to get to the right college. It's about how is this person being shepherded to sort of learn how to learn. That in healthcare alone are things that, being very general, but in the States, a majority of citizens don't have, a majority. And so healthcare costs normally come from, say, the emergency room, which if people had health insurance, they wouldn't have to depend on that. Anyway, how do we get out of this? First of all, is the critical need to recognize metrics that have data attached to them that are not fanciful or esoteric. People tend to think like well-being metrics are, people hugging and saying, I feel good, right? It's very subjective. Whereas the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals were created, and I know the people that created them, Professor Sandy Pentland out of MIT, for instance, helped really drive these. And I interviewed him. You can watch the interview. He said, you create these metrics, right? Sometimes you create new metrics, but the SDGs have, 17 different goals. And what's very clear about those, which I love, is all of them have to be dealt with. You can't only solve for the water crisis and avoid poverty, for instance. You can't only think of avoiding poverty and not address mental health or the planet. It's really challenging because what happens is, understandably, companies or individuals were like, well, I can't focus on all 17, so I'm going to focus on number 8. And then ironically, they'll be like, so I'm going to create a company that's going to IPO and have exponential growth, but we can really help with number 8. But they're kind of missing the whole point. The metrics is for IEEE, and you were kind enough to mention IEEE, and I'll mention them here. Standards like the Wi-Fi standard are tools, paper documents that are instruments that can be adopted into policy that are really powerful because they're formed by a consensus of a lot of people working on an issue over many years. So Wi-Fi happened because 300 people for 5 years said, this is the way that most people are now going to access the internet. So 7010, IEEE 7010 is the name of the standard. I was the founding chair, then my friend Laura Musikansky took over and just did an incredible job with the working group, which is focused on well-being metrics, but mainly first of all, it's a tool for education. So in terms of, say, creating something for the environment, many people don't know about something called the Happy Planet Index. It's simply a data-laden set of indicators that if you're going to build, say, an autonomous vehicle, along with any sort of existing ESG or emission standards, you can use those metrics and say, we like the Happy Planet Index. We like what they're measuring. We're going to build our autonomous vehicle, where once we design it and build it, before it goes out to the world, we're going to use the Happy Planet Index to sort of say, how are we doing? And those key performance indicators then mean the company can know, and certainly tell the world, it's a PR and brand thing as well. We wanted to do not just a better job, but we wanted to do a job, right? A job.
Yep.
Same thing with mental health. There's all these, Gallup, the World Health Organization, et cetera, have metrics about human agency, so that, for instance, like when kids play with certain toys, you can examine how is their sense of self-worth increasing or decreasing.
Yeah.
And all these things, by the way, also, once you examine them, they lead to increased innovation. They lead to avoidance of harm. It's a reprioritization of what we're thinking is success and how we design things. But the first step is sort of saying, is what we're measuring now working? And the answer is I think unless someone has an agenda, no. Resoundingly no. Humans, in terms of mental health, and the environment in terms of environmental health, it's not working for the majority of people on the planet. So then how can we switch
Mhm.
that around? First is to say these things have value and we will measure them. It's a lot of work, but also in our actual lives, hopefully, we don't say, hey, women are great, but I don't really care about anything they're going to say. And children are great, but it's okay if in 20 or 30 years they can't really breathe air. It's so hard to comprehend that those metrics provide a way for us to say, whoa, this is not about my company being evil or good or talking about ethics. This is about the simple fact that if I don't take care of these things, like my physical health, if I eat a pint of ice cream 14 times a day, there are consequences.
I understand, and I personally recognize something. That was listening, while you were talking. My brain goes doing stuff with myself because I had a couple of conversations here in Nice, in France, because I'm quite involved with the local government here. I know these people. I've worked with them. They're nice people. They're not bad or something, and they're not your enemy. You know, no matter their political color, it really doesn't matter. And we had a couple of conversations about environmental well-being, social well-being, economical well-being, that we need to to find a way to rebalance those forces, because we have this blind focus just on economic growth. And I think that question actually becomes easier to answer the more local you go, which opens a whole other conversation in the, let's say, in the field of governments. When you look at governance, we've built this wonderful multinational globalization system where there's one guy usually sitting at the top and designing everything top down. But we actually find out, if you want to rebalance our basically anything you just said, environmental, socially, economically, if you want to rebalance our activities in there and indeed develop the right metrics and get access to the right data, it makes more and more sense when you see it on a very local level. Because also for as a person, because to me also, if I think, how can we address these topics on a European level? Oh, wow, it's really immediately my mind is like, oh, that's difficult. But when we go down to a more local level, you actually start looking at that whole issue in a totally different way, and you're talking about your daily life. So it's easier for your imagination, also in your creativity, to go to that level. Having said that, I think we really need a thing called Imagine here. I had the pleasure of being in a presentation of Rob Hopkins. He's coming from England. He did a presentation here, and I went to see him. And he's basically talking about the same kind of topics here. And his vision in there was, and I tend to agree with him, we need to relearn to imagine. We need to relearn to use our natural creativity as a human from the heart space, and just imagine what our local place where we are actually living our daily lives would look like in 10 years or in 20 years. If we can imagine that, we can measure anything that has an impact on that future environment and work our way backwards to get it done using data. So there you go, John. You're not the only one who starts to think this way, uh, which is a wonderful thing when I look around me, and I can see that people who are in the governments of the Nice area where I am living they're really carefully listening to these kind of presentations today, and they're really considering how can I make this part of my political agenda, in a sensible way that it becomes visible to people and that it also becomes measurable. I think it's an earthquake. I haven't seen that happening before. So it's moving. That's the good news. When you ask me, I can see it happening around me that people are wondering, okay, so I can imagine something. So, how do we get there and how do we measure our activities that it actually contributes to where we want to go? Which is a very valid question. In
Yeah.
my corporate background, we ask ourselves this question all the time. We're doing something, we're investing in something, where we're giving time and energy to something. Okay, but what's the, be practical. What is the bottom line effect of it? What are the good effects and what are the side effects and what are the bad effects? You need to measure that. If you don't do that, you're blind. You're just feeling good about yourself because you did a lot. So I think I personally feel that the climate is changing in terms of the way we deal with it and the way we look at things. So please tell us, John, your institute, because I know you are really deep in this these kind of topics. How is your institute contributing to setting these standards?
Well, first, you made so many great points there, and there's so much reason to be positive. And it's country level, but I definitely want to mention like New Zealand. Prime Minister Jacinda, I always forget her last name, but for the last couple of years, they have created their well-being budget, I think they call it. And there's, I think, 4 or 5 areas, but one of them is children's mental health. So this is simply other lenses, because they also still focus on economics. But they say, I'm paraphrasing, but for our countries to be defined by what is good for our society, we must prioritize children's mental health.
Her name is Jacinda Ardern, by the way.
Ardern, thank you. Yes, I always forget the last name. But then that means the next question is, well, how do we measure that? Which is a great question. But they have pretty thorough objective and subjective ways to measure those things. Objective, things with mental health is like, do children have access to a school nearby? Do they have access to therapeutic help? So these, a lot of times, again, people think, well, how do we measure these things? They're actually being measured. They're just not being prioritized at different levels to be measured more universally. And secondly, countries like Wales, they have, I forget her title. I think it's the first of its kind, but she's the office or the future commissioner of future citizens, which is really kind of a wonderful way to say the same thing that the First Nations people say about the next 6 generations. But what's exciting is you see the reports, and they call them well-being reports, that each of the different divisions of that government have to provide. They get pretty community level specific. And there's fascinating research. My friend Laura Musikansky created, it's not with IEEE, it's a publication called Springer, the first field of study on community well-being. But to your point, Vim, if you do things like, for instance, I think this was a study done in Boston, a big part of human well-being is security and safety. Do you feel safe where you live? Which makes sense, right? It has to do with crime. So I forget what neighborhood it was in Boston. There was a sort of a advance of crime, and what the Boston did is they had a lot more police cars drive around more than they had been before. They measured before and after simply what was community level or citizen level sentiment. On a scale of 1 to 10, how scared are you? Describe specifics. So some of it was just maybe their own fear, but it was also things like 4 of my neighbors got robbed, and if that's true, then that's objective and subjective data. But then as those cop cars, the police cars drove through and people saw them, then they gave the same type of survey again to citizens. How do you feel now? Then the safety, how they felt, the numbers went up. We feel more safe than we did 2 months ago. This is gold. to politicians, as it should be, because the point is that using those metrics, hearing citizens at a community level what they need and responding to them, that then can say, and here I'm agreeing with you, at a community level, this is a pretty big part of what you guys need, and we did our best to serve it. So that type of research, Boston and Somerville, Massachusetts, for years, I actually knew them even before I was at IEEE, did some of I think the world's first happiness surveys, which are based on science. It's not just what's your mood. There's different types of psychology, positive psychology, empirical data about when you ask someone, it's called the Cantrell scale, on a scale of 0 to 10. What is your sense of your own flourishing, like your long-term happiness? Now, this is not your mood, because your mood for the day, you might be in a good mood, bad mood. But why this is relevant, why this is exciting, that this is starting to take place more often. I actually had a famous statistician named John Hall from New Zealand. I said, there's all these metrics for understanding well-being. What do you recommend? He said, I like the Cantrell ladder, because if I was to ask, Jana and Wim and John, how they felt their life on a scale of 0 to 10, 10 being you're ecstatic. From day to day, that means they're telling me how they are experiencing the world. And they're the only people that can give their subjective truth.
Yeah.
Why that's so exciting is, I'll speak from the United States. I got lucky in the sense that my dad was a psychiatrist, my mom's a minister. Talking about emotions for me was pretty standard. But I'm a 52-year-old guy. It's not necessarily standard to talk about emotions in general. Mental health is still very stigmatized in general in the States, although if you have access to a therapist, that's not really stormed. But when I was younger, my dad, he didn't get like persecuted, but he got mocked. People didn't understand what a psychiatrist was. So that's a generation. That's my dad. So the good news is people are recognizing that mental health is the same as physical health, period. In the sense of, if you don't maintain your physical health, shocking, your health goes down. Mental health is not just like you wake up and you go, I'm good. It's not about your mood. You have to do things like, the equivalent of going to the gym. Anyway, so I know I haven't talked about IEEE. The standard I mentioned earlier, 70-10, gives a process for people to analyze what's called the triple bottom line. So if you're about to build a piece of technology, this is not dictating how they should build it per se. It's about saying the lens, like you said about imagining, instead of just building with the metrics you already have, imagine how your product or service or system would look different if you also had these benchmarks to improve mental health and environmental well-being. Now, some might say like, oh, that just sounds like a massive pain, right? But the point is that by definition, it's going to be innovation. You're asking questions you've never asked before. It is research and development. And where people say like, yeah, but I can't justify it. The answer is, well, think about the second you're able to say your autonomous car will rescue X amount of green space in a certain community. Then you can go to the local government and say, do you want less parking lots and more parks? And there's so much data showing how parks increase human well-being. And then
sorry to interrupt you, John, because you just said something that really triggers something in me. So when you go drive an electric car, you can indeed show a justification via data how that contributes to the well-being of your living environment, as in quality of your air that you breathe and the quality of the etc., etc., etc. I think when we are ready and understand profoundly that we actually have this data and can agree on the standards we use, how to do the presentation around these data, it will enormously contribute to the quality of the discussion and the conversations about that. So why are we not doing this on an enormous scale? We should. I'm going to discuss this also with my local government here. Absolutely, because you're totally right. And I think we need to use the data coming from other sources, and then come up, with nice graphs and design, to show the evolution and the evolution in the future of that data. Because it totally changes the discussion when you can show in data, if we plant so many trees in this city and we avoid so many uh, internal combustion engines in this city, and we replace them with the electrical ones, this will be the actual effect on the quality of the air we breathe every single day. Oh, that might be that's going to be a shocking presentation.
Yeah, I mean, just to kind of wrap up this, the world I imagine is one that starts and ends with, in one sense, kindness. Kindness to ourselves is something that mental health is critical to be a part of, and also say the family structure or maybe a faith-based structure. In a lot of non-developed countries, again, I hate that term,
Yeah.
family structure is the center. And by the way, I bring up Denmark here as an example. There's a wonderful documentary called Happy, the movie. I can't recommend enough. And it talks about this sort of row house, I think, in Denmark, just sort of like a big kitchen and dining room and a big hallway, and then essentially 10 apartments kind of jammed into the, right? So it's a little community. And they interview this one woman who's got 2 young kids. She's a single mom, and she's crying. She's saying, I couldn't afford to live here if I had to pay a babysitter. She said, if I was in town in the center of Copenhagen, I'd be in a tiny apartment and I would never see my kids. Here, the folks that are seniors, that are older, watch my kids if I can't get home on time. My kids are asked to be a part of the kitchen. They have to prepare dinner twice a week, so they get a sense of the community. This I would equate to a lot of like indigenous cultures I've read about, where in one sense, when you're born or where you live, you have a place in that society where you have worth. That's based on, first of all, just existing, right? You don't have to do something big or make a lot of money and then you're on the map. It's like, no, you're a child. So here are the things you do. You have chores, but then you're part of a community. And then you're going to click up to adult, and then you're going to click up to senior. And in all those places, you will have respect and dignity and something to do. That's, first of all, the world I imagine. Is I've lived for 30 or 40 years in my adult life where I've chosen professions like acting, where I had to face every day the knowledge that people automatically, unless they're like, are you a rich actor? Are you a famous actor? At least, men certainly, then you don't really have any worth.
Yeah.
And same thing for parents and kids. We don't look at our kids. I think most parents don't look at our kids and go like, hey, I'm so glad I just gave birth to you, or that you're my child. But I'm not really going to love you until you're like, I don't know, 15, or maybe if you win some kind of an award when you're 10. So I imagine a big imagining is this veneer, this falsity that was created with the GDP will be removed. And that phrase is like, let's get back to business. People recognize what they're saying. I'm uncomfortable with what we're talking about with emotion or whatever. I'm uncomfortable with that. So I'm going to use a phrase like, let's get back to business, because society has said that it's okay to talk about money. And it's okay for us to talk and kind of compare each other about money, and success looks like money, versus if someone's talking and says, I need help, or mentally I'm struggling with whatever. Why wouldn't the room freeze? And I'm not saying that anyone should provide, counsel who's not an expert in mental health, a practitioner, but to say, wait a second, Bob is suffering. Let's take care of Bob. Then the other stuff we'll focus on. And people will say that that's inappropriate for work. My answer is, well, what we're doing now doesn't work at all.
No, you totally resonate with me again, because I think when you talk about design errors, money should be in service of our well-being and the well-being of the planet and all life on it. And it's just a way of thinking, and therefore a way of designing what we feel is important out there. we need to hit the reset button here, because if I'm not, if I'm not okay, if I'm not well, and I can have these days, I'm just human, depending on the mood. Um, I know very well that if I don't change myself, or I don't, become Wim, which is a pretty challenging thing to do in this society, because you're constantly distracted by all kinds of noise, which is actually not your noise. If I don't become really myself and really kind to myself, and in total state of abundance with my own being, I'm absolutely not able to be with someone else on that same level, per definition. It's so simple when you look at it. It's so basic. Uh, but I agree that, coming back to Finland, uh, what I have seen is that the Scandinavian countries are doing a brilliant job here. They're really showing the world in many ways uh, how to do transition from an old model to a new one. I also saw this weekend that Norway is now about selling 90% or something of all vehicles in Norway today that are sold are already electrical vehicles. That's absolutely mind blowing. They're so way ahead. So somehow they have found out how to do these transitions, and I think it starts with you and me.
Now we have to say that Norway is, of course, a very, very rich country, and the electric vehicles are heavily subsidized, and they've got tax benefits, and they don't have to pay for parking in certain cities and all that. So,
Oh,
so I agree that's a good move, but it's of course very costly for the government. But it's setting the example to the rest of Europe and beyond. Just one small remark. We're almost at 1 hour, so I don't know which critical parts we still have to cover. I think maybe we also move to the subject of AI, artificial intelligence.
yeah, well, happy to, because I'm also wondering inside my brain, Jana, about that one. Because I understand that we need data. I
Mhm.
understand that we need standards to measure the evolution of data in all the areas of our society, economy, and environment. We're getting into a world where artificial intelligence is becoming more and more important. And we know that you are involved in that one also, John. So could you please enlighten us with your view on that one?
Sure. And just to mention a couple IEEE things, any of the work that I help drive, you can go to a website called ethicsinAction.IEEE.org. So the words ethics,
Okay.
IN, action. All of our work that I drive is volunteer based. So any of your viewers or listeners that want to get involved, my email address is j.c.havens, which is HAVENS at IEEE.org. So please get in touch because we're always looking for people to join this work. It has
Yes,
to be.
or get in touch with us, Climate of Change, Jana and me, our accounts on social media, and we will redirect you immediately to John.
Yeah, all the links are
Wonderful.
in the description below. Sure.
We will do that.
Great. I'm going to try to also make sure that Veem and Yana join some committees. No pressure. Because, just saying. Um, so we recently came out with another standard called 7,000 is the number of it. And I'll mention this briefly to your question about artificial intelligence. A key aspect, like in my book, Heartificial Intelligence, I ask the question, how will machines know what we value if we don't know ourselves? And algorithms, in one sense, know us better than we know ourselves because when you track everything you eat and everywhere you go and every tweet that you say, with machines, you start to have a picture, or algorithms and technology, you start to have a sort of sense of how you are projected to the world, just in ways that we don't normally think about, right? Because if you have a friend say something about you, they may only know one piece of all that different stuff. But what's a big part of my book and then the work with 7,000 is to recognize that whether or not people measure their values, in general, that's how they actually live their lives. Now, you might say, what does that mean? Well, for instance, if you value family and you want to raise your kids near a school that you care about, you'll probably move from one location, maybe when you're in your 20s to your 30s. I'm being very general. But the point is if your values are about family, first of all, you're going to have kids, and then you're going to change your behavior to honor those values. Similarly, based on your faith traditions or what have you, or things like you're in love, like your values, the things that actually dictate a lot of the center of who we are not measured in GDP, but yet they are why we make the core decisions oftentimes of our lives. Anyway, IEEE 7000 has a formal methodology called value-based engineering, which analyzes end user values, like the word privacy, and says when this piece of technology is being used by these end users, women in a certain region of a certain country, for instance, how do they view that word privacy? So first of all, it's not a question of how do the manufacturers feel or what is our intention with what we create. It's solid due diligence research. The demographic who you're building for, how do they think about these things? And doing what's called participatory design, asking them. Now, you don't pander to them because I'm being extreme. What if wherever you are on the planet, they're like, well, we like to kill people. Then the answer is start with human rights always. But where you can analyze those values, IEEE, the standard 7000, then has a methodology to what's called use values elicitation, identify those, analyze them, and then, as it were, translate them into design level requirements. And the shorthand that we talk about this is from principles to practice. Talking about values, talking about AI principles like transparency, very important. But engineers, and with a big paper we have called Ethically Aligned Design, 300-page paper, Creative Commons, free to download at the Ethics in Action website.
Yeah, it's right on the front page, I can see. Yeah,
it's about actually building these things. So there's a couple of IEEE things. We also have an AI certification program we're developing. But ultimately, kind of back to that kindness idea, is where people aren't trained to analyze their own values, then that's also oftentimes where there's a sense of malaise or confusion about their lives. And I'll give an example in the book. There's a famous psychiatrist, I think it was, last name of Schwartz, who had these famous lists of values. And say, for instance, family, just a list of values like family, being outdoors, et cetera. Those are two chief values that he talks about. And then you take 2 weeks and measure on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being like you're outside all the time in the environment and you just feel so close with nature. 1 is you're not even outside. And for 2 weeks to simply measure, did you live to your values? And it's a very rudimentary approximation, 1 to 10, right? But even just seeing at the end of those 2 weeks, like, I started this research on my own life thinking I loved being outdoors. And I do, but after 2 weeks, the average is like a 3. I'm never outside. So then here's the shocking idea. Go outside more. And then for 2 weeks, say, I'm going to readjust and prioritize being outside. Now, what that means is some of the other values that you maybe have been spending time at, like work, will diminish. But it's a way to test this aspect of your values. And by the way, I know we all know a mutual friend named Gabrielle Arruda, who with Philosophy Arts does this philosophical inquiry, which is focused on this, right? Analyzing your values and teaching kids at a young age how to discern values through art. Well, the same logic is for 7000 and for a lot of work I do, which is simply saying using technology for the same thing. But it all begins with recognizing and acknowledging I have worth. I'm worth taking the time to even understand what do values mean. And then if you see a list of things like family, faith, whatever, going, of that list of 10, these 3 are the ones that are most important to me. And then seeing what it's like when you live to those values. These are taking metrics for yourself. And I can tell you again about another project that we're actually working on in a minute, but I'll pause there and see if that all made sense.
Impressive, John. And in my head, there is a question. I just saw that, just a couple of weeks ago, we had this announcement coming from Tesla that they decided not to just build an autonomous robot on wheels, which we call a car, but they're also going to build an autonomous robot on legs, which starts to look like, human hybrids, etc., etc.
Humanoid robot, yes.
Exactly. And so I'm wondering, you should talk to Tesla because we should develop standards for robots to become very kind toward us. Because I think it's interesting a human fear also here when you talk about automation, that people are so afraid that the robots are going to take over. When we actually can implement a standard on kindness and the way autonomous devices operate, we're remaining in full control of this issue.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you brought that up. There's already, in fact, the first international standard I know of focused on ethics along the lines of what we've been working on comes from an organization called BSI, British Standards International. And my friend Alan Winfield was part of the committee that created this robotic and ethics standard. And a lot of things people don't think about until you study it is something what's called the morphology of a robot. You don't have to have a robot be equipped with a gun to kill somebody. If a robot looks like a human enough that you anthropomorphize it, meaning you start to kind of think it's real or alive. And we have a chapter in Ethically Aligned Design about this, focused on affective computing, meaning affect human emotion, where you give the buyer of that robot and then the user and anyone that's around that robot really informed consent. And that has to be like, hey, this robot looks kind of human. So be aware that when you kind of get lonely and you start talking to it, like, remember that it's a robot, But when you give that level of informed consent, then when the robot, which is designed to help do things, says things to a person or has actions, there's always that frame of reference. Like, okay, I know this is a robot, and I'm kind of thinking it's a person, like a little child, knows the teddy bear. If the parent says, the teddy bear is not actually real, at a certain age, it's like, yeah, I know, but they can believe it very easily. That's the part about robots where you go from what's called nudging. And nudging is like if I was like, hey, Yana, I'm trying to lose weight. When I go out to dinner tonight, tell me not to have dessert, right? I'm about to put my fork in the brownie. And if Yana's like, hey, don't eat that, I might be mad at Yana, in a fun way, by the way. But that's him nudging after I've asked, like a health watch or what have you. The manipulation is what can be done now through algorithms when you are inspired to say purchase or do something, because right at a certain literal moment, based on algorithms knowing us better than we know ourselves, at 3:34 in the afternoon is when John starts to feel a little depressed and wants a sweet thing, So boom, here's the ad for the candy. It's in that sense, it's like, well, okay, so I get candy, but that same logic can work with anything. And that's where the robots are a physical manifestation of these issues, but it's really the underlying algorithms that are the big deal.
That's one of the things that struck me when the robot was presented, is that they put a limit on how fast it can walk, and they actually also put a limit on how strong it is. And that sort of scared me in a way, because I thought, okay, many things can be taught to this robot. Many things can be, instructed to the robot. If I say, I want you to kill John, I want you to grab him by the throat. But so they built in the ability for the robot to not catch up with John, so John can run away. And that's sort of one thing that sort of implies that a lot is possible also in a dangerous manner with these humanoid robots in your house.
Yeah. Which is in line with what Elon Musk has said before on this topic, that it basically scares the shit out of him as well.
Yeah.
Well,
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Tesla does a lot of amazing stuff. The thing that the precedent of with autonomous vehicles overnight, allowing through a patch through the internet, vehicles to go from one level of autonomy to the next. And then you saw all the videos of people in the back seat going, look, the car is driving itself. as a geek, I love the technology. It's not a question that like, holy crap, that's amazing. It's recognizing like when you watch those videos and people are like, well, the person signed a waiver. They knew they were going to be in the back of the car, but the people on the highway next to them didn't, and those could be your kids or my kids. And that's when I'm speaking for myself. My answer is no. Why do you get to do that? You get to do that because the market-based system, going back to GDP, says getting first and fast out to the market. That's the way the world operates. And my answer is, then change the way the world operates. And oh no, I can't change the way the world operates. Why? It's the tiniest portion of people that we're still catering to. And this is going to sound anti-business. I'm not anti-business. I'm anti the metrics that certain businesses may use. Anyway, on a positive note, just because also I got to probably wrap up in about 2 or 3 minutes. I want to say thank you so much. And I love the title of the show. I love what you both are doing with the show.
Thank you.
I did want to mention, I'm very excited. I'm doing a project focused on kindness. And you can find out about it at KindNext, because we're calling it KindNext. And the URL is kindnext.io. And I mentioned Gabrielle. We're actually working on this together. And the basic idea, just because I want to end on a really positive note, where people don't have training to understand that they can be kind to themselves, more and more I'm finding that's a fundamental issue that all humans deal with. And when you talk to someone who, because of their upbringing or maybe their education, maybe they were part of an indigenous culture, whatever it is, and they say things like, well, yeah, I know I have inherent worth. And I know how to be kind to myself. I take walks in nature. I meditate. I have faith-based whatever. That might sound kind of strange to ask, but that means, in my opinion, why hasn't it been asked before? If you can be kind to yourself and you have actions to know how to be kind to yourself, I exercise, I do this, I do that, then that means you now have the ability to be more kind to other people. And then the final thing, so our research, although we're still working on the questions, the first question is, how are you kind to yourself? And I love listening to how people respond, except that I'm finding more and more often people go, I don't know. So we should know. And then secondly is, how are you kind to others? Usually that's been a little bit easier for people to say. But the third question, the reason it's KindNext, is in the physical, digital, algorithmic realm that we kind of live in now. Although, of course, we're talking over Zoom, right? Or whatever format. So we're not actually together. We're actually right now digital atoms flying back and forth at each other. In the immersive realm, if we don't know how to be kind in the existing physical realm to ourselves, robots are certainly challenging with all the stuff you guys just said, but think about avatars. Think about the nature of time shifting. Think about the fact that when you put on lenses, the world that you see will be through that one myopic lens of the manufacturer of those lenses, like Facebook and Oculus, for instance. So kindness, very excited to focus on this at a deep personal level, because my hope is, and when I talk to people, especially kids, etc., if you know how to be kind to yourself, and I don't mean in an arrogant way, I don't mean you're prioritizing your kindness over others. I just mean if you actually think, I have enough worth to take the time to even know, I'm hoping that will positively transform the world. And Gabrielle, as you guys know, has real expertise on teaching values to kids. So it makes it very practical. I don't think adults, at least Americans over age 25, I never got that training. I never got training about kindness. So I'm really excited about that project. And I just wanted to say thank you again for the opportunity to be here. Anyone that wants to join the IEEE work can. And yeah, I just really appreciate the time.
Yeah, we put all the links in the show notes, also to KindNext, which is a good site. I've just watched it, and there's a good summary of what you guys are actually doing. So yeah, thank you, John. Wim, you want to close? Any closing words, thoughts?
No, the only thing I can come up with right now, John, is that you're so absolutely right. You have no idea how right you are.
Yeah.
And I think kindness is a beautiful way of ending this episode of Climate of Change. And we will do our serious. We will also do our best here to get some to get some basis in our way of thinking, working, acting, deciding what we're going to do in our lives and with the environment and everything around it, based on kindness. Thank you so much for teaching us that.